Governor Pat Quinn gets ready to tell us the state of the state while the battle intensifies among the Republicans seeking his job. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. The campaign is heating up, and a couple of experts are here with me today to talk about that and how the state is doing. With me today are Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at University of Illinois Springfield, former State House reporter for the Sun-Times long ago, but for a long time. Charlie, welcome back.
Thanks, Bernie.
And Chris Mooney is here, recently got a promotion to Director of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs for the whole U of I system. Used to be at UIS. Chris, welcome, and
Thanks.
nice to see you again.
Thanks.
And congratulations. The campaign is intensifying. We have Bruce Rauner, one of the four Republican candidates for governor, has kind of set the tone of the campaign as the guy who has a lot of money, so he's been doing a lot of television advertising. But he's also become a target because he got so much money because he was involved in many businesses through buying and selling of businesses through a firm that he was a principal of and worked with for 30 years. Charlie, and then of course the other three candidates, forums are beginning and we're starting to see stories come out about problems with some of these companies. Where does this shake out? Is it, going to be, is Rauner the key? Is he likely to be the candidate that will make it out of the mix, or do we know that?
Well, I don't think we know at this time, and I think one of the, what would you say, variables or the uncertainties is there is a lot of information about Bruce Rauner, some of it coming up recently, some of it going back further, that might cause him to be less attractive to Republican primary voters. The fact that he's close friends with Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and was kind of like Rahm's godfather in making him a millionaire. The fact that he has contributed to Democratic candidates, that kind of thing wouldn't sit well with the Republican base, a lot of the very conservative people there, if it were very well known. On the other hand, some of the things that have come out lately about his business dealings, which portray him as somebody who is all about the money and doesn't care about the consequences and the repercussions on the little people's lives, which is sort of, if you want to be really good at being one of these types of investors that he was, you kind of have to have that idea. It's got to be all about the money. That might not play well in the general. But the big variable is those of us who are, who follow this stuff diligently, who are sort of like, addicted to it, are aware of this. But does the general populace know? None of the other three Republican candidates seem to have the dollars necessary to put out the vast media barrage that would make this more widely known among the general electorate. So I think that's the key thing. There is stuff out there that would cause people to want to vote against Bruce Rauner. The question is, how well are his opponents going to be able to communicate that to folks who would be who would have their vision of Rauner as presented to them through his barrage of television advertising, who would have that notion of him changed.
Okay, just to add to part of our viewing audience who may not be that familiar, Capitol Facts is, of course, a newsletter and an online presence, very important in state government and watching Springfield. And one of the things that they reported this week was that there was a Cardinal Logistics Management Corporation, and what they do is they're finding old stories and posting them that come from other places. This group was sued, and drivers alleged that they were basically working as employees but not getting regular employee benefits because they were independent contractors, and that was deemed to be incorrect, and Cardinal paid a $3.75 million to create a settlement fund. So in other words, drivers were working, sometimes there was one listed as 6 days a week, but not getting paid as a regular employee, but doing everything that the company wanted, so the company was avoiding some of the regular costs of employment. And this is a company that was owned at the time by this firm, GTCR, that the R was Rauner in that equity firm. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Chris, your thoughts on if things like this will have an effect in the primary?
Well, that remains to be seen, and mostly what you guys do. You guys with the pens and the microphones, because that, I mean, the other three candidates in the race, in a sense, are sort of hapless at this point because they don't have anything like, Rauner's got more money than Midas. He's got it personally, his buddies, he calls him up over on a Saturday night, play a game of poker, let's throw $100 million or whatever it is into his pot. So that's not his worry, whereas, you know, Rutherford is the most well-financed of the other three, and he's got enough to maybe put some commercials on in February.
$1 million some, and let's just name the other candidates for governor, because it's not a, you know, it's Dan Rutherford, the state treasurer, Kirk Dillard, state senator from Hinsdale, and Bill Brady, state senator from Bloomington, are the four in the race.
That's right, and you know, Rauner is the most recent example of a common phenomenon around the country in the last couple of decades, and maybe it goes back even further. I suppose maybe it's forever, but. Of the rich guy, and it's usually a guy, but not always. Meg Whitman out in California spent over $100 million losing to Jerry Brown last go around. But who, you know, they've got all this money, they've been successful in business, and they think, now what do I want to do in my retirement? And it would be nice to, you know, be called governor around the country club or senator at the end of the day. And so they jump in, and you know, it's maybe out of civic duty, and they want to give back, or they just, you know, they want their ego stroked. Who knows exactly what it is, but they get in, and they think because they've been very successful in business that they all automatically are going to be very successful in politics and government. And that's not always the case, especially in a place like Illinois, where politics is, it's more of a profession. It's, you know, as Barack Obama says, politics ain't no game where you put the beans in the bag, you know, and so, you know, so what happens is these guys will come up, they run, and if you are in business, especially in the kind of Shark Tank business that he was in, you're going to do things. I mean, things will happen in your business that aren't going to look that good if they get spun the right way in the front page of the paper or an opposition ad. There's a couple of them that come out lately. Which one sticks? Who knows? Also, you don't know what he's going to do when things get rough. It's great when you're putting on commercials and you can dress exactly right and you can do multiple takes. When you guys go sticking your microphones in his face and say, "What about this? What about that?" How does he react? We don't know. Sometimes they blow up.
He reacts sometimes, because when I asked him how much he had given, like, the Illinois Policy Institute one time, his response to me was, I gave him a lot of money. And I said, well, was it $1 million? He says, I love you, man, because he thought he didn't have to answer me. And then his people answered me the next week and said it was $500,000 over 5 years at least. But that was the attitude early, was he's you know, he's in charge.
That's his pattern, though. He's tried to avoid reporters. When was the last time he actually had a news conference here in Springfield with the State House Press Corps?
Well, he hasn't had a news conference per se, but he had an appearance at the Sangamo Club, and that was back in the fall, and that's when I asked him those questions. I have not seen him in Springfield since, unless I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, and if I were advising some guy who's got all the money in the world and who decided to be cool to be governor, on his campaign, I would tell him, stay the heck away from the State House Press Corps, because they know more about this stuff than you do, and they're going to be testing you by asking you questions about issues of which you have no clue. And so your best thing is just to avoid them, hire this fancy image-making company and these production folks that will put out these wonderful commercials, and you can talk about how you got a regular guy jacket and you got a cheap watch, and you know, you do all these things like regular people, but don't get involved in any settings where you actually have to respond to questions about policy issues of which you have little or no knowledge.
Okay, but Charlie, that, I mean, isn't what you're saying, you know, a way to just fall? Because, you know, reporters like myself, the Chicago papers, people do ask questions, and there are forums.
You keep trying, but but no offense to my former colleagues in the Chicago media in the broadcast area. But when I was a reporter down here, I always figured that candidates would go to Chicago to appear before the TV people, because the TV people don't have the same grasp of issues as the reporters in the State House do. And it's because TV people cover a whole lot of stuff, and they're not experts. And particularly in Chicago, they know more about City Hall than they do state government. So if you're running for state office, go to Chicago, get on the tube, you can pretty much have your way. Down here, you get asked hard questions by reporters for whom state government is their life, and that's it.
Well,
And let me say another thing about Rauner too. He's in a situation where he can say, Bernie, I want you to do this. And you'll say, yes, sir, Mr. Rauner, boom, 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 off to do it. Chris, I want you to do that. Yes, sir. And so he talks about he's going to run it like a business. He'll stare down Mike Madigan. He knows how to deal with him. He doesn't need anything from Mike Madigan. Well, no offense, Mr. Rauner, but in fact, you do need something from Mike Madigan. You do need something from John Cullerton. If you're going to be governor, you have to pass a budget. That's the basic fundamental thing of the legislature and the governor. You also may have programs you'd like enacted. There is no way, no conceivable way in my mind that Democrats will not control both chambers of the General Assembly throughout the term of whoever is elected governor in November. So if you're a Republican governor, you are going to have to deal with Mike Madigan. You can't say, Mike, do this, and have Madigan say, yes, sir. No, it doesn't work that way. It's a whole different setup, and I don't think Rauner appreciates that.
Well, he talks a tough game, and we'll see how far it gets him. If it's interesting because people look at this Republican race and say, well, if it's not Rauner, if controversies out of his companies or whatever, or out of his changing positions like on the minimum wage that we saw in recent weeks, end up derailing him, then which of the other three emerges or should emerge, or will somebody have to drop out, or will they just split the vote, and will Rauner, because he is known by more people from TV ads, probably make it anyway as the candidate? Or who should it be?
Well, at this point in the primary, you just don't know. And I always, when I'm talking to students about this, I'd remind them that 2 weeks before the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate in 2004, Barack Obama was third in the polls. And a guy named Blair Hull, who was the Bruce Rauner of his day, not as rich as Bruce Rauner, hardly anybody is.
Yeah, in that race, right?
Absolutely. He was in the lead, and suddenly something came out, and he punched his wife in the ankle, was it, in a divorce paper?
Something.
Yes, and boom, that was it.
Divorce file
and,
came unsealed.
Suddenly the rest is history. So that's what I mean about these guys are wild cards. You don't know. And this is say nothing about his quality. He might be the greatest governor we ever had if he gets in office, but as a candidate, you just don't know what's going to happen to him.
Okay. Pat Quinn is going to have a State of the State address next week. What is the State of the State? Has he got any good news to share, or how is this going to come off? Obviously, he's probably been, while he has technically an opponent on the ballot, T.O. Hardeman from Cicero, who ran a ceasefire program up around Chicago. Not a well-known person, so Pat Quinn is very likely to be the Democratic nominee without a hassle. So he's probably just enjoying what the Republicans are doing to each other, but they keep saying in their campaigns, and so do candidates for state rep and state senate, Illinois is the worst state in employment, and we're in debt, and people can't find jobs, and people are leaving. So what good news does he have, or what can he say that builds his base and builds his chances for another term in office?
Well, it occurs to me that he will cherry pick some of the things that he can talk about. He'll talk about getting the pension legislation passed, and he'll say this, I put all my efforts into doing this, and I took away the legislators' pay, and I threatened this, that, and the other, and they finally sent me a plan that I could sign, and it's going to save us $160 billion. He'll talk about that.
30 years, right?
Yeah, but he may not mention he'll just say $160 billion in unfunded liability. He'll talk, I'm sure, about same-sex marriage. He'll talk about the legalization of medical marijuana. He'll talk about individual programs that he can tout. He'll look at some of the economic development things. He'll talk about some of the companies that have decided to locate here. He'll talk about the fact that Illinois set a record, I think it was last year, it was almost, $400 million in money coming into the state through television and feature film movies, through the film office.
Video,
and there are enough things out there that he can point to buttress his record. And he'll talk about the challenges ahead, particularly the challenge in putting together a budget when we're looking at a revenue cliff that we're going to fall off to the tune of almost $2 billion. But it'll mostly be saying, I've done all these things, and remember what it was like when I came. We had no capital program, and I put in a capital program that's created, hundreds of thousands of jobs across the state.
Right. $30 billion that they spent over a number of years.
Yeah, and the state of the state is not so much an objective analysis of here's where we are and here's where we need to go, here's what our problems are. It's an opportunity for a governor to brag about himself, all the wonderful things he's done.
I can
And
already.
I've covered these since the days of Dick Ogilvy, and there's never been anybody who, in my mind, came in and gave an objective analysis of what the strong points and the weak points. It was always about me, what I've done. Don't forget all the good things I've done for you folks, and here's what I'm going to do in the future.
And I can already hear the response in the Rotunda area. Right after he finishes his speech, the Democrats will say, yeah, this part was good and that part was good. We'd maybe like, and the Republicans will say, but unemployment is so high and he's not solving the problems.
Will say it was all horrible.
And I don't know, Chris, do you think the governor will even say, it's not his budget address, that comes later, if he wants to extend the income tax increase, because we have 5% personal income tax since 2011. It used to be 3%. It's supposed to come down to what, 3.75
for
as of
individuals,
2015, which is the second half of the next fiscal year, which is a drop off of what, about $2 billion in revenue?
Something like that. Depending on the estimates, it's anywhere from $1.5 billion to $2 billion.
Okay, so is the governor going to even deal with that in this speech, or say where he wants to go? He hasn't really said so yet.
No, and I don't know that it's it's a political speech. I mean, state speech serves two functions. One is to promote the governor, to be a political speech, and the other one is to set the legislative agenda. If the legislature and the governor were thinking clearly about the state of the state, especially this, fine-tuned on the state budget, which is way out of whack and continues to be so. And with this tax decrease coming up in December, you think that'd be the number one thing they're going to be focused on. They're going to work on it hard, and they're going to get that sorted out. But it's also an election year, and people don't like taxes, and they don't like spending cuts. We've been through a lot of spending cuts in the last couple of years, which is another thing he may tout. But we haven't had enough cuts.
Well, the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, which you are now the head of, Chris, recently had a study come out about kind of long-term financial look at the state. How about a review of that, and so we can add a little reality to whatever the governor's going to say?
Well, Richard Dye, Dave Merriman, and Nancy Hudspeth are three of our public finance people, and they did an analysis of they have a model that projects out revenue and expenditures for the state. It's very good. It's very comprehensive, and they applied the numbers from the pension systems, their estimates of what the pension changes are going to be, and not surprising that anybody's really paying attention. The pension reform doesn't do a darn thing. And then in fact, I shouldn't say that, because it's supposed to save about $1 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money. But they project out to 2025, and in that year, if we are on the same course, we'll be spending like $13 billion a year more than we're taking in, even with the pension reforms, and assuming that the pension reforms pass constitutional muster and the state actually puts the money in. I mean, those are just huge assumptions. But even if that happens, we're still in trouble. Even if we keep the extra tax, that cuts that deficit in about half. It doesn't fix it. We are on a serious financial problem in this state. Probably the worst state in the country. All the other states, not all the other states, but many other states are having a bounce back. The economy's picking up. They did a lot of slashing during the recession, and now California's got a surplus. A few years ago, they had like $35 billion in deficit, and that's not what's happening in Illinois.
Well, I keep hearing, state employees that we come in contact with in Springfield, many of them talk about how many people they've lost in their agencies and how many jobs they're doing that used to be done by, one or two other people. So what is the solution long-term for Illinois? Is it more cuts? Do we have to raise some other taxes, which of course nobody wants to do? Is there a solution? which
All of it.
Or Charlie?
Yeah, and I would say that the work that Chris and his colleagues have done over at the Institute is sort of like the latest update in an ongoing saga. As a matter of fact, you guys put out a similar report back in, I think it was October, that said pretty much the same thing. And the pension reform, what it does is kind of delay the ultimate day of reckoning. And if you look at it historically, the reason why we got to where we are now with the pension system is for Lord, probably as long as I've been on earth, the demand for goods and services provided by the state, which politicians, governors, and lawmakers want to give to their constituents who like this kind of stuff, has always exceeded the capacity of the state's revenue system to generate the dollars needed to pay for them. And for many, many years, the way we avoided that harsh reality was by just not putting the money into the pension systems as we should have. And finally we got to the point where, well, we can't stiff the pension systems anymore. Now what are we going to do? And we stopped paying bills, and the deficits continue to grow. It's basically a mismatch between a revenue system that in some respects is based on old-fashioned, maybe antiquated models. You look at our sales tax. Our sales tax involves me giving something to Chris, like I give him a pen, he gives me $1 for the pen, and the state charges it. Now, if I say to Chris, I will write a speech for you, instead of giving you the pen to write your own speech, the state doesn't get anything off that.
So, in other words, you're
We
talking
need
about
to
broadening
tax
the base
services,
for
yeah,
services
and
haircuts
back in the
and other things.
Depression days in 1932, when we instituted the sales tax, most business involved that kind of exchange of real stuff. Now, most of the economy is based on services which are not taxed by the sales tax. That's just one example. There's others out there. So Illinois is basically has a revenue system that doesn't match the modern economy, and as a result, the studies that Chris's folks have done have a reasonable expectation of revenue growth into the future, a reasonable expectation of the growing cost of the existing programs, no new programs, the existing programs adjusted for population growth, adjusted for inflation. And whenever you set the revenues and the spending at zero, at the same base point, and take them out, the spending always increases higher than the revenues. It doesn't matter where you start. And that's been true. As I said, your latest report is just the latest in a chapter. This has been true for, Lord, I don't know, decades, and it's been reported. You guys have done work on it prior to your term there. Fred Gertz has been talking about it for years. The Center for Tax and Budget Accountability has been talking about it for years. So it's no, what would you say, it's no great revelation.
Right, but it's always hard for the legislators to figure out, or those in charge.
Well, and I think
to handle
I
it.
think a
They
lot of
know
the
it.
legislators know it.
They
No,
understand.
I mean they know
But you
it,
ask,
but to
you ask
reach the solution.
constituents, do you want to pay a little more? Oh no, taxes
Right.
are too high, which is not true relative to other states. And that's, well, here's what we spend the money on. Should we cut back in education? Oh Lord, no. Healthcare? Oh my God, no. Public safety, fewer prisons? Oh no, no.
So again, you're talking about some increase in revenue, as in expanding the base of the sales tax.
Yeah, or going to a progressive income tax,
Right,
a
which some
graduated
people do,
income
and then
tax rate, or taxing
people on the right are
retirement
just dead
income.
set against that because they say it'll hurt our
Well,
economy.
or we could, like I was saying before the show, we could legalize marijuana, put a pot store next to the new casino on Navy Pier, and its happy days are here again.
And there will
in
be
more
another-
than one way.
And there will be another round of hearings that Representative
But
Bob.
what I would like to
about
see, though,
gambling
is
and expansion.
to have the candidates, the governor and the Republican candidates, address this honestly. I don't think they have the courage to do so for fear that it was going to, interfere with their campaign plans or their chances of success.
I did just start to mention Bob Rita, state representative from the suburbs, overseeing kind of a bill to try to expand gambling, 5 new casinos, and I think slots at horse race tracks, which we don't have yet, even though we now have gambling at like bars and restaurants all across the state under basically the system that is paying for the road, the construction plan.
Capital plan.
That Pat Quinn passed. Any chance we'll see that kind of big expansion of gambling coming up in the future, or is that kind of off the table right now?
It's always on the agenda. It doesn't usually pass. And, I would not bet for it, but you never know if it'll happen.
And everybody's betting in Illinois now. There are a couple of petition drives going on in the state now, one for a term limits plan, and Bruce Rauner is actually doubling up. He's donated money to this plan. He's helped hire the people from out of state to collect signatures to put an 8-year term limit on members of the General Assembly and other state officers. Is that likely to get on the ballot and be found constitutional? I know that it would slightly raise the number of members of the Illinois House and slightly decrease the number of members of the Illinois Senate. And it
would also require a higher majority to override a 2/3 instead of 3/5 majority to override a governor's veto.
Okay, and some of those extra elements are in there beyond the term limit because our state constitution only allows referendums to be effective, be more
Well,
than
if it-
advisory if they deal with the legislature itself.
Well,
And
they have to deal with the form and the procedures
So
of
do we
the
think that
legislative.
do we think this one would pass muster and will get on the ballot next year or this year?
If any, it's probably got the best chance of anyone in the last 30 years. I don't know that it's necessarily, it's all up to the Supreme Court, and they've been very tight on this. But it's, they've thought this through carefully. They've got good lawyers, so they got it sorted out. It is a very popular initiative, and I will tell you one thing: if it does get on the ballot, it will pass, and it will pass significantly.
And I'm going to guess Charlie thinks that's a bad idea.
Yeah, I do, and I'm kind of old-fashioned. I think that there are term limits. The Constitution provides that members of the House of Representatives are elected for 2 years. Members of the Senate are elected for 4 years, but because of the quirks of, I guess, the number system, that 4 doesn't go into 10 equally.
2 or 4-year terms they have.
Yeah.
So you're just
they get
saying
two
let the
4
voters
years and they get
decide.
two, but they have to go back to the voters regularly. And so the term limit is if I'm a voter and I don't like my legislator, I can vote against him. Now the people who say, well, that's spurious because we have these gerrymandered districts, nonetheless, even in the gerrymandered districts, the people who are elected from the gerrymandered districts get votes from people who want them to represent them.
Right, and the other, I have to end up, so I'll just mention that the other plan would change the way we do redistricting in Illinois.
We'd have no more gerrymanders.
Right.
Or a different kind of
supposedly-
gerrymander.
So,
kind of
but again,
gerrymander,
that would also have to overcome a challenge and get enough signatures. We'll see how it goes. Going to have to end it there. Charlie Wheeler, Chris Mooney, thanks for your help and your conversation. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.